Let's talk about a probation officer in Mississippi that might end up in jail himself after he wrongfully kept somebody else locked up. Michael Whitfield is currently under investigation and has already had his law enforcement certification suspended after mishandling the case of Derek Boudreaux. Boudreaux was arrested in 2019 by the Gulfport Police Department for 3 drug charges and possession of a stolen firearm. A year later, he pleaded guilty to 2 of the drug charges. Judge Dodson sentenced him to 8 years in custody, 3 years suspended with 5 years to serve. Upon his release, he was to serve an additional 3 years of probation. He's released early from prison in October of 2021. He has a parole agent, and now he's supposed to report and pay his monthly fines. But after his first parole check-in, he disappeared. So then there's a warrant issued for his arrest. February 4th, 2025, he's arrested by the New Orleans Police Department after getting into a fight. The charges dropped right away, but because of that parole warrant from the Mississippi Department of Corrections, the New Orleans Parish Jail holds him. Without that warrant, he would have just been days away from his scheduled release from parole to probation. There's an unnamed MDOC parole agent who ends up pulling the warrant, signs the papers, and discharges Boudreaux from parole. Enter Michael Whitfield. He ends up signing these papers and takes Boudreaux under post-release supervision. And you might be thinking, okay, things we can get caught up, we can fix stuff, right? Well, Boudreaux ends up spending just over a month in the Orleans Parish Jail before Whitfield actually files a petition to revoke his probation. So he's sitting there in this Orleans Parish Jail, still hasn't been extradited back to Harrison County, just chilling. And then Whitfield ends up reporting that Boudreaux has not reported for probation. So he takes over this supervised release now that he's on probation, now that Boudreaux's on probation. And then Whitfield says, hey, he's not reporting for probation, even though he's sitting in custody. And according to Noah Noble reporting for WLOX, this petition calls to be apprehended and booked into the Harrison County Jail, but it does not mention that Boudreaux's actually sitting in custody in this New Orleans Parish Jail the whole time. In April, he's finally extradited to Harrison County, but then Whitfield waits another month before sending a revocation hearing request to the court clerk. And that brings us up to a May 22nd hearing with Judge Lisa Dodson. And Dodson had some questions. So, why would you withdraw the parole warrant? Whitfield says, so I can get a parole discharge from MDOC to put Boudreaux on his probation. Dodson ends up pressing further, why didn't you want him to face the parole board? Agent Whitfield ends up saying, well, the board would not revoke with just 2 days left. Now, this is where this seems like a conscious choice and not just a paperwork filing error. Dodson then questions Whitfield why he would sign a petition for failing to report when the agent knew Boudreaux was behind bars in Louisiana. So we have Whitfield explaining why he withdrew the parole warrant, because he didn't want the opportunity for Derek Boudreaux to go in front of the parole board and have them say, look, there's just 2 days left, let's square this away. And then, knowing that he did this, he then chose to sign the petition for failing to report and asking for a revocation of the probation. So here's a transcript here provided by WLOX. Judge Dodson says, you've abused the process of the court in doing this, sir. You had a warrant and held him in custody wrongfully, knowing he couldn't report. You know, the fact that he's not paying when he was supposed to start paying, Officer Whitfield. And Whitfield responds, he wasn't supposed to start paying the court until after he was on probation. Judge Dodson, that's right. And yet you put that in here that he's failed to make any payments when no payments are due yet. And y'all wonder why people sue the MDOC. Does that make sense to you? Because it makes no sense to me, Judge Dodson said. And then Whitfield comes in with a justification saying, well, he has a history of not reporting, Your Honor. Dodson says, have you lost your mind? And then Dodson ends up scolding Whitfield again. The court, so you let him sit almost another month before you even set his hearing. You let him sit in Harrison County from April the 15th to May the 9th before you ever sent an order to get a hearing set, right? Why are you laughing? This isn't funny. None of this is funny. You know, reading this, it seems to suggest that something about Whitfield's body language came off as if he thought it was a laughing matter. Dodson makes a decision to hold Whitfield in contempt and threatens him with 90 days in jail, which is the same amount of time that Boudreaux ends up sitting behind bars at this point in time. And then the DA's office came in and dismissed the petition to revoke Boudreaux's probation. 6 days after this contempt hearing, a different individual, Jama Beckman, also assigned to supervised release under Whitfield, was arrested on a field warrant on April 24th of 2025. And lo and behold, Michael Whitfield took nearly a month to file the petition to revoke Beckman's probation. And so Whitfield is held in contempt again. The judge issues an order that reads in part that this is not the first time in which this probation officer has improperly held a probationer in custody, nor is this the only issue with this probation officer. Probation Officer Whitfield's actions are prejudicial to the administration of justice. This order was handed down on May 28th, and this Monday, the 14th, Judge Dodson was supposed to announce sanctions, but after getting a letter from the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, which informed the court that, Whitfield's under an administrative investigation related to this improper jailing of Derek Boudreaux and maybe more, Dodson suspends Whitfield's law enforcement certification and ends up setting a new date to consider sanctions for August 5th. And most interestingly, I think, are these two details here. So WLOX news reporter Noah Noble, boots on the ground doing this investigative work. He submits a public records request to MDOC to look for disciplinary actions or complaints against Whitfield. MDOC denies that public records request. But Noble has reported some information about the time Whitfield was employed as a police officer with the city of Picayune, where he received disciplinary action for 2 infractions in February of 2022. They're described as minor and non-criminal, but a month later, Whitfield did resign from that position. So, March of 22 whereabouts, Whitfield resigns from his position as a police officer and ends up going into the supervised release field. And my thoughts on this series of events are that I have serious questions about oversight in our criminal justice system and what can go wrong on supervised release, and if and how supervised release can be maliciously weaponized against an individual who's released from custody. It sounds all well, fine and dandy, and then someone can just play games with the system to get them back into custody and back in trouble again, and have a court believing that they've missed payments that weren't even due yet, and yada, yada, yada. I'll link to Noah Noble's work. Shout out to Noah Noble for doing a great job covering this story. I searched the story and didn't see it covered by any other outlets. I'll drop a link in the description so you can come over and play this video here. If you know anything else about this story or have other similar stories, drop a comment letting us know. And thank you for watching. Hope you guys all take care. Bye, guys.